For news and opinion that you won't find on Fox or MSNBC, check out America's Survival TV on Roku, in the channel store under News and Weather, or on the Roku website, use access code USA123, or on YouTube at the USA Survival Channel, America's Survival TV on Roku.
Radio for Readers, Bookmark.
This is Bookmark. I'm Marc Peraino. The nation's top authors are coming up next. With the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address and the controversy that surrounds when the president would go and what he would say, there's been a new focus on Abraham Lincoln once again. Kevin Peraino is the author of a book about Abraham Lincoln and President Obama at the same time and how one leads to the other. It starts off funny when I first read, Kevin, thanks for being with us, that Lincoln is approached by some people that want to appoint someone, have the president appoint someone that's supposed to go to the Sandwich Islands, which later become the Hawaiian Islands.
Right.
They're saying that he really needs to go there because, like, the weather will do him good.
Right.
I would have given anything to have had video of what it must have been like for Abraham Lincoln to listen to this. He goes, well, there's some other people a lot sicker ahead of him.
Right, exactly. That's one of my favorite stories in the book, and that's something, by the way, that Lincoln's friends tried to work in his own favor before he was president too. In 1841, Lincoln's friends tried a similar tack. They said Lincoln was going through a bout of depression. He was a young man at this point in the early 40s, and his friends approached the Secretary of the State at the time, Daniel Webster, and said, Lincoln's really not doing too well. You should send him to Columbia to be a consul in Columbia. And Daniel Webster, not surprisingly, said, "I think I'll pass on that." But that's one of the things that struck me as I was researching my book, which is about Lincoln's foreign policy, is some of the hurdles that he had to overcome. I mean, the diplomatic corps at this point is not a very professional diplomatic corps. You've got Lincoln's minister in St. Petersburg, Cassius Marcellus Clay, walks around with Bowie knives hanging from his waistband, getting in fist fights on the streets of St. Petersburg. His minister in Paris ends up dying in the room of what Carl Sandburg called a woman not his wife, and his body has to be smuggled back to the embassy. So it's kind of a motley crew. And I'm telling those stories because they're fun. He had very capable diplomats also. His guy in London, Charles Francis Adams, his grandson of John Adams, has a family history in diplomacy. So he had capable diplomats too.
In this book, you do see similarities between Lincoln and Obama in terms of their attitude about people. There's sometimes an arrogance that both of them have. There's an assertiveness. And our listeners have told us they've picked up a subtle arrogance by the president. But I never knew that about Abraham Lincoln.
Well, there are similarities and there are differences between Lincoln and Obama. On Lincoln, when you're talking about diplomacy, was a natural diplomat. I mean, he was there's a British journalist who encountered Lincoln in the first days of his administration, came into the White House and said, where most diplomats, European diplomats, will kind of shrug or tell a little white lie to get out of a difficult situation, Lincoln will tell a story or a joke and crack everybody up. And another contemporary at the time said Lincoln's laugh was like the neigh of a wild horse. President Obama's laugh is not the neigh of a wild horse. That's not really his style. But I mean, there are some similarities. One Lincoln biographer compared Lincoln's approach to decision making to that serenity prayer that they teach by Reinhold Niebuhr. They teach in Alcoholics Anonymous class. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that knowing the difference between the things you can change in international affairs, which isn't always a lot, and the things you can't change is a pretty important skill. Lincoln was great at it. President Obama also has said the author of that prayer is a guy named Reinhold Niebuhr, a Protestant theologian. He's somebody that Obama has said that he admires also. So I think he aspires to that as well. But it's always a tricky business trying to say what would Lincoln do about something like Syria or drones or something like that. But Lincoln liked to say, he had a saying, he said, in a fight between man and wife, you never get between the wife's skillet and the man's axe. And so he was very wary of sticking his nose in places where he felt like it didn't belong. So I have my doubts about whether he would be a vigorous proponent of intervention in a place like Syria, but obviously impossible to know.
I kind of got the impression that Lincoln was not really comfortable with the problems going on in Europe. And as time was moving on, he was dealing with an American Civil War here, but there were things going on in Europe that were requiring his attention. And I got a sense, and maybe, hopefully I read it right, but I got a sense in your book that this is something Lincoln really didn't want to deal with. Did he delegate that?
He delegated a lot of it to William Henry Seward, his Secretary of State, and he had a very competent and strong and powerful Secretary of State in Seward. And that's one of the reasons, I think, Mark, that there hasn't been a book about Lincoln and foreign policy in so long. I mean, there hasn't been a holistic human narrative of Lincoln and U.S. foreign policy in 70 years, which is before the Lincoln Papers were even released in 1947. So there's a lot of water under the bridge since then. And I think the reason is that he did delegate a lot. And if you put Lincoln right at the center of his own foreign policy, you end up with a hagiography. And so what I've tried to do is slice it a little differently, because I think the things that Lincoln did do in foreign affairs were really important. So I've tried to focus on these episodes where he was deeply involved without saying he did everything, or without saying he did everything right, by the way, because he made some mistakes also. I've
always been curious, do we learn much in this book in Lincoln's relationship with his vice presidents?
No, not really, not particularly. They weren't, they weren't major figures in the diplomacy of the Civil War. So we learn a little bit about, Lincoln's relationship with Seward. We learn, but
he was very close to Seward, as I recall, who engineered the purchase of Alaska later,
right? After Lincoln's presidency in 1867, I think. But he was close to Seward. He didn't start off being close to Seward. They were rivals. Of course, we know from Dorsgren's Goodwin's great book, they were rivals in the 1860 election. But Seward had traveled in Europe a lot more than Lincoln did, and he challenged Lincoln a little bit early in his administration for control of foreign policy. But by the end of Lincoln's term, they had become very close. They had become friends. They would go over to each other's houses and talk late into the night. And one Seward biographer said the relationship, they're like each other's sober second thought. That's the word they used. And it was almost like a husband and wife relationship where sometimes Seward was right, sometimes Lincoln was right. They would kind of bounce ideas off each other. And I think in the end, they did a pretty good job of handling foreign affairs together.
If I'm not mistaken, Kevin, he picks Andrew Johnson from Tennessee because he's looking past the Civil War. The nation, he figures, is going to have to heal. Let's bridge the gap by bringing in a Southerner who is a moderate. He can help. He's thinking past his administration, isn't he?
Yeah, and I think, well, there's a debate about why he was looking at Johnson, but one of the anecdotes that I love is right when he picks Johnson, right when Johnson is chosen in the summer of 1864, then Johnson goes out and let me just contextualize this a little bit. France invades Mexico in the middle of the Civil War. They conquer Mexico City in 1863. So Lincoln's got this major foreign policy challenge, and he's basically, as you said before, trying to stay out of it. He doesn't want to get involved in what's going on south of the Rio Grande, even though there are members of the penny press, people trying to get him to invade Mexico, essentially, to unite with the Confederacy. So Johnson is chosen, and then Johnson goes out. Lincoln makes this very careful thing saying, we're not going to do anything. Don't worry, Napoleon III in France. We're not going to invade, kind of assuring him. Johnson comes out and gives this rousing speech about, let's go get Napoleon's army in France. So he immediately became inconvenient in some kind of ways. But he wasn't a major player in the diplomacy.
I read something outside of your book that I found kind of interesting in this regards of this foreign policy discussion, that the Confederacy was so desperate to find an ally because they could feel it was slipping away late in Lincoln's term, that they put an overture out to England and to Spain. And they say, look, come with us, help us win this thing, and you're going to get some of your property back. They did it with Spain, too. Meanwhile, France is conquering Mexico. And my understanding was Lincoln's reaction was, good luck, because the British had basically said twice in 1 century is enough, we're out. And the Spanish didn't want any part of it, but there was a potential for a problem with France, which had been an ally to this country. But they were so busy with Mexico that they didn't come in. And so, but Lincoln sort of ducked that situation. It could have been disastrous for him.
It's a really good point, Mark. And throughout the war, basically, the Confederates are making overtures. They send, their own diplomats to Europe to try to woo British statesmen, French statesmen, Spanish statesmen, and I think you put your finger on it, that the interests of the European powers weren't necessarily to intervene and break up the Union. Sometimes, I think on a visceral human level, the leaders of Britain and France, Palmerston and Napoleon, wanted to see the United States go to pieces. Palmerston used to crow about the disunited states of America, and after Bull Run, he called it Yankees Run. He liked seeing the chaos across the Atlantic, and Napoleon did too. He told people that at the time, but they both had interests in keeping the Union whole in some sense. There were very strong commercial and financial ties between the U.S. and Britain at the time. Britain was the United States' largest creditor, and so there are economic ties. And France, I think, is even more interesting. Britain is France's historical enemy. The Napoleonic Wars were only 30 years earlier, and so, or something like that, 30 or 40 years earlier, and so France sees a whole United States as a counterweight to Britain in some sense. So they both had realistic interests in staying clear of the war, and Palmerston said it over and over. So Lincoln's job then, I think, is to keep from screwing that up and to keep from letting some of these diplomatic crises flare up into war. And I think he did a very good job of that.
We're talking with Kevin Peraino in his book about Abraham Lincoln and the similarities and the differences between Lincoln and Obama. For President Obama, does he look at Lincoln as more than just a fellow Illinois person? Is there something else that's compelling about Lincoln to President Obama or not?
I think there's something compelling about Lincoln to every single president that occupies the Oval Office, Republican or Democrat. I mean, he's just one of those quintessential American figures that everybody tries to wrap themselves in their mantle. President George W. Bush invoked Lincoln in his second inaugural address, talking about Iraq. I forget the quote exactly, but it was something about people who, I forget the quote exactly, but he invoked Lincoln in his second inaugural address. Obama obviously invokes him all the time, and so I think everybody tries to, and there's something, and I think all of us, are there's something about Lincoln that's just captivating, and I think it's partly the narrative at the end of his life, that kind of the emotional high of winning the Civil War and then the emotional low of the assassination. There's something just really moving about that. Every time I did a lot of the research for this book at the Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield. Have you ever been there, Mark? It's
no, I have not.
It's amazing. It's actually I think they had Disney engineers do it, and it's very moving as you go through the life and you get to the end and the kind of the victory of the war and the assassination. And there's something about Lincoln, I think, that just has the power to captivate.
How does Lincoln handle his difficult, at times, marriage?
That was one of the interesting things in my research that I found, is that he did have a difficult marriage. Mary could be a difficult person, and she also had, by the way, a difficult life. I mean, she had 3 of her children died in her lifetime, or she saw her husband assassinated before her eyes, so it wasn't easy being Mary Lincoln, but she could be difficult, and she was in many ways more cosmopolitan than Lincoln. She grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, which was known as the Athens of the West at the time. It was a pretty cosmopolitan place, and she went to a school where the students spoke French, and so she and her family, the Todds, were more cosmopolitan than Lincoln, and they kind of lorded it over him. Lincoln liked to needle them and say, 1D was good enough for God, but not for the Todds. He kind of would needle her about these pretensions of the family. And she tried to get one of her candidates appointed as a diplomat in the Sandwich Islands in Hawaii, and she tried that one unsuccessfully, I think, but she tried successfully to get somebody appointed as a consul in Scotland. And
she had her own agenda, but it doesn't get played very often.
She had her own agenda. She hated Seward, the Secretary of State. One of my favorite moments is Cassius Marcellus Clay, the guy we were talking about before in St. Petersburg, was a childhood friend of Mary's, and he in his memoirs or a letter or something describes a scene of him coming back to the White House and talking to Mary, and Mary says, Cassius, don't worry about Seward. I know he's your boss, but nobody pays any attention to him. I mean, can you imagine Michelle Obama is telling, somebody, European
Frankly,
diplomat?
I can.
You can, right? Because that's, what it is? It's a human story. That's the way people work. They have their vanities, and so.
An extension of your book, do we find out what happens to Mary after the president dies? Does the country take care of her, or had there been no mechanism set up for that once a first president to be assassinated, so there was no precedent for this. How does America take care of her, or do they not take care of her?
She felt very poorly taken care of. She felt she had financial problems after. I don't Mark get into this in great detail in the book,
Right.
but she did feel badly taken care of. She had financial problems after the president's assassination, which she blamed on being not well taken care of, but she had financial problems during, when Lincoln was in the White House too. She was a pretty free spending character. But one interesting thing about Mary Lincoln is she actually went to Europe after the assassination. She spent a lot of time living in France and traveling in Europe, and after the assassination, and she was always. I always think it's kind of funny because she was always this Francophile in the White House, and kind of, as I was saying, kind of lorded it over Lincoln, and studied French and copied the French empress's fashions when she was in the White House. When she actually lived in France, she came to hate the French. She writes some very funny letters about how much she disliked the French. So yeah, she ended up kind of wandering in Europe for a while with one of her sons before she came back.
How Lincoln Shaped Obama's World, the subject of the book by Kevin Peraino, our guest today on Bookmark. So good to see you, sir. Thanks so much for coming in. Fascinating writing.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.
That's Bookmark for this week. If you have comments or thoughts on future authors, send an email to us at our website, bookmark.us. That's our broadcast for today. Thanks for watching.